Essential question 2 is, why did the expansion of slavery become the most divisive political issue in the 1840s and 1850s? You have to understand here that the big question to be settled after the Mexican cession is gained in the Mexican-American War is how, if at all, would the United States expand slavery westward? Because this Mexican cession is not subject to the same rules as territory that the United States had at the time of the Missouri Compromise. So potentially you have all this territory that could be open to slavery, and that sets up a debate in the U.S. Congress between these two sections of the country, slave and free, over how we should settle these western territories with slaves or without. And the first salvo that's made in this debate is going to be something called the Wilmot Proviso. The Wilmot Proviso was introduced to Congress, and it proposed to ban slavery in all the territory gained from the Mexican cession. This new territory would not be covered by the Missouri Compromise, as I've said. But the Wilmot Proviso ultimately does not pass. So why do we even talk about it if it's a law that doesn't pass? Well, that's because the debate that ensues over the Wilmot Proviso split according to section rather than party. So you had Congress debating as Northerners and Southerners rather than as Whigs and Democrats. And that is an important split that's going to really kind of indicate the way this debate is going to continue into the oncoming years. Around this debate about how to expand slavery, if at all, into the West, comes the emergence of a new political party called the Free Soil Party. And the Free Soil Party emerged to oppose the expansion of slavery. They wanted to preserve the Western territories for the economic betterment of small farmers, in particular small white farmers, rather than wealthy plantation owners who would expand slavery westward. They appealed to abolitionists, people who wanted to abolish slavery, as well as non-abolitionist Northerners who saw this party's platform as protecting them rather than protecting, wealthy Southern plantation owners. Some Free Soilers, I should point out, opposed African American settlement of the West altogether. So you don't want to think of the Free Soil Party as a purely abolitionist party, because there were certainly some racist ideologies underlying some of their elements of their platform. So although the Wilmot Proviso doesn't pass, the way that the extension of slavery into the Mexican cession is settled is by a package of laws called the Compromise of 1850. And the Compromise of 1850 has multiple parts, but we're really going to focus only on 4 of them. These are the 4 main elements of it, and the ones that typically show up on the APUSH exam, if at all. I shouldn't say if at all. The Compromise of 1850 will be somewhere on the APUSH exam, where you'll definitely have an opportunity to use it. So this is important. It's important to keep in mind alongside something like the Missouri Compromise of 1820. So the first part of the Compromise of 1850 is that California would enter the Union as a free state. It's going to be this part of the Compromise of 1850 that is intended to make anti-slavery advocates happy. The second part of the Compromise of 1850 is that the slave trade, but not slavery itself, was abolished in Washington, D.C., and this was intended to make Southern slavery advocates happy. So in the nation's capital, you could still own slaves, you just could not buy or sell them there. Something else intended to make Southern pro-slavery advocates happy was the third part of the Compromise of 1850, which established a new, more stringent or stricter fugitive slave law that would put the full force of the American government behind slave catchers who went north or into free territories and free states to capture runaway slaves. And it's going to be this new, more stringent fugitive slave law that will be the most controversial part of the Compromise of 1850. The reason for that is that it brings the issue of slavery home to people who don't live in slave states. They will see the horrors of slavery as freed slaves, or I should say runaway slaves, are captured perhaps in their city or hometown, and they may actually have to interact with the parts of that part of slavery whereas they never expected to before. The fourth and final part of the Compromise of 1850 to talk about here is that the remaining parts of the Mexican cession, would decide the issue of slavery according to a concept known as popular sovereignty. And this means that the people of these territories would get to vote whether they would be slave or free. I should point out here that that process for popular sovereignty in the remaining parts of the Mexican Cession is not very clearly defined, so it wasn't very clear how that vote would happen, but nonetheless, that's how slavery would be decided in these territories according to the Compromise of 1850. So again, the four parts of the Compromise of 1850 to know is that first, California would enter the Union as a free state. Second, the slave trade was abolished in Washington, D.C. Third, a new, stricter fugitive slave law was enacted. And fourth, the rest of the Mexican Cession would decide the issue of slavery according to the concept of popular sovereignty. The last thing to add here is that the debate over the passage of this compromise was very heated and very sectionally divisive, even more so than the Missouri Compromise back in 1820. Quickly, I want to go back to looking at the Fugitive Slave Act, that stricter fugitive slave law that was the most controversial part of the Compromise of 1850. So the new Fugitive Slave Act put the full force of the federal government behind slave catchers. Also, the fate of accused fugitive slaves was to be settled without a trial, and also local authorities could not interfere in the activities of these slave catchers or slave hunters. This increased sectional tensions as some Northerners and Northern states resisted this new Fugitive Slave Act, and they would do this by passing so-called personal liberty laws. These were attempts to allow states to resist this law, and it only inflamed sectional tensions between slave states and non-slave states. Another political event that made the expansion of slavery such a divisive issue in the 1840s and 50s is going to be a law called the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and this was passed in 1854 by an Illinois senator named Stephen A. Douglas, a name to remember for future reference. Stephen A. Douglas wanted to build a transcontinental railroad that would pass through his home state of Illinois, but in order to do that, he had to incorporate the territories of Nebraska and Kansas, which this railroad would pass through. So he proposed, the Nebraska territory. So he proposed dividing the Nebraska territory into two new territories, the Kansas Territory and the Nebraska Territory, so that these could be properly incorporated and they could build that railroad through there. And he proposed that the status of slavery in these two territories would be decided according to that concept of popular sovereignty, or people of that territory voting to decide whether they would be slave or free. And as a result, pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers rushed to settle this territory so that they could have the majority when that vote came to pass. Like previous compromises, the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act caused intense sectional debate between northern and southern states. Ultimately, it passed, but it would cause further controversy and division as these settlers move into these territories. We'll talk more about that in a future question. I should also add that the Kansas-Nebraska Act effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise by potentially allowing slavery north of that Missouri Compromise line, which would have been drawn at the southern border of the state of Missouri.